respect of those requests. It's document ID DOJ.501.001.6207.
Dr. Mark 217.
If the board pleases. Those are the housekeeping matters, Madam Chair. So I'll invite the Premier to take himself off mute and invite your associate to administer the oath.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Premier. I'm assuming you can both hear and see me.
Yes, I can, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And I understand that you wish to take the oath today for the purposes of giving your evidence, Premier.
Yes, Madam Chair.
So I'll have my associate administer the oath to you now. Thanks, Madam Associate.
Please raise the Bible in your right hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Will be the truth.
Will be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Premier. If you can put the Bible down now and I'll hand you to Ms. Elliard. Thanks, Ms. Elliard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could you tell the board, please, your full name?
Daniel Michael Andrews.
And you're the Premier of Victoria.
I am, Miss Elliard.
You've made a statement in response to a request that was made of you by the board. Do you have a copy of that statement with you?
Yes.
It's dated the 16th of September 2020.
It is.
Are the contents of that statement true and correct?
They are.
I tender that statement, Madam Chair.
Exhibit 218.
Premier, you refer in your statement to a number of documents, and we understand that some of them aren't able to be produced by reason of their status as National Cabinet documents, but you also refer to a number of documents being documents of the Victorian Cabinet to which you've had regard and which you wish to have incorporated in the evidence that you're giving to the board today. Is that correct?
Yes.
Madam Chair, I tender the attachments to the statement of Premier Andrews as contained in the hearing book.
Exhibit 219, thank you.
Thank you. Premier, I wanted to ask you first some questions about the state of affairs that existed prior to 27 March when the decision was taken by National Cabinet to establish a program for mandatory quarantine for returning travellers. And my call up, please, Mr. Operator, document HQI.0033.0058. Premier, are you able to see that? Is it large enough for you?
Yes, it is.
This is a direction given by the Deputy Chief Health Officer in exercise of powers that were available because of the state of emergency that had been declared on the 16th of March.
Yes.
And in particular, this is a direction that was issued requiring that returned travellers on and from the 18th of March 2020, as we see in paragraph 4, isolate at home for a period of 14 days after their return to Australia.
Yes.
And we see, if we go to, perhaps I'll ask Mr. Operator if paragraph 4 could be enlarged for ease of everyone's reference. We see, thank you, Mr. Operator. The direction that was made required a person to travel to a premises suitable for them to remain and reside there except in exceptional circumstances and leave only in the limited circumstances set out there.
Yes.
Is that so?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Operator. That can come from the screen. Can I then also call for a second document, HQI.0001.0033.0054. This, as I understand it, Premier, is another direction made by the Deputy Chief Health Officer, which applied to those persons who had been diagnosed with novel coronavirus to isolate at home for a period of 14 days.
Yes, I believe it is.
And that, as we see from paragraph 3, took effect from the 25th of March 2020.
Yes.
And as I understand it, whilst there might have been variations from time to time, it's remained the position that those who are in the community and who have been diagnosed with COVID-19 have been subject to a direction in this form requiring them to isolate at home.
Yes, that is correct.
Unless they required medical care, in which case they've been taken to hospital.
Yes, Ms. Elliott.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Operator. That can come from the screen. Premier, at paragraphs 23, 24 and 27 of your statement, and by all means look at it if you would like to, you refer to one thing that you were aware of in the period leading up to 27 March, which in your mind had some relevance to the steps that should be taken and that were taken by National Cabinet on the 27th of March. And that is your awareness of reports, at least reports on the 23rd of March by the then Chief Commissioner of Police, that there were instances of non-compliance with the first direction that we looked at, the direction that required returned travellers to stay at home.
Yes.
And were those reports of which you were aware reports made by Mr. Ashton to the media, or were they reports that had been made directly to you, or perhaps both?
Both, I think, Ms. Elliott. I was aware of those media reports, and beyond that, I understood that there were other details, other reports as to non-compliance.
Thank you. I want to play, Madam Chair, a short extract from what I think might be one of the media reports, Premier, to which you're referring, being remarks made by Mr. Ashton at a press conference on the 23rd of March, at which you were also present. May I ask, Madam Chair, please, that we have the recording at HQI.0001.0033.0019, if we can start at the 13-minute mark and go through to 14 minutes and 5 seconds.
Doing this particular work. For us, we've already been seeing examples through the spot checking we've been doing where the community haven't been following the requirements regarding self-quarantine. We've had instances where in the spot checks people haven't been at home when they should have been at home, and people that have freely said we're at home for some of the time, other times we're out shopping, we're out doing things. So clearly the message hasn't been getting through to the degree that we really need to see to make sure that we can deal with this health emergency in a proper way. Hence we've had a need, obviously, through the good work of everyone involved in terms of making the right decisions to keep people safe, to go up the ante and adopt new measures. And we're in a position now to be able to do the enforcement for that. I should stress that it'll be part of, as well as having dedicated officers to the task, it will be a part of our general patrol work to be making sure that people are complying with these arrangements as well. So in addition to sort of 500, there will be in fact many more when we look at all the patrol work that will be done, including this in their everyday work as well. I should point...
Thank you, Mr. Operator. That can stop there. Premier, is that the... were those the remarks that you had in mind when you refer in your statement to remarks made by the Premier on the 23rd of March?
By the Chief Commissioner.
I'm sorry, the Chief Commissioner on the 23rd of March?
Yes.
Thank you. That can come from the screen, Madam Chair, but may I tender that document, please? And as an aide-memoire, a transcript of the conference that's been prepared. So I'll tender the document that I've already referred to, and also the transcript, which is HQI.0001.0033.0024, if they could be tendered together.
Exhibit 220.
Thank you. Premier, I want to take you to some further public remarks that, as we understand it, were made by the then Chief Commissioner 2 days later on the 25th. May I call, please, Mr. Operator, for HQI.0001.0033.0023, and could we start at the 1 minute 24 mark and play until the 2 minute and 29 mark?
calls. To date so far, we've had we've done 88 visits today, as of today, and we'll be doing a lot more today with the extra numbers out from today. But of those 88, we've had 70 people home and doing what they were supposed to be doing as far as isolating themselves. 7 people were not home. We're doing follow-ups as to where those people are. We had a couple of people who provided the wrong details to Border Force as to where they were supposed to be going to when they returned from overseas. So we're obviously following those up as well. And we're doing a couple of people we're still chasing up in relation to where they are in fact self-isolating because they're not isolating at their home premises. So we're doing some follow-ups on that as well. So that work is continuing. So we can see certainly since earlier in the week we're getting certainly a lot more people now doing the right thing and staying at home and self-isolating as they're supposed to do, having returned from overseas.
That could be paused there. Thank you, Mr. Operator. And could I ask that we, in the same document, move ahead to 4 minutes and 51 seconds and play through until 5 minutes and 4 seconds.
We haven't found anyone yet because people that we have found that haven't been complying, haven't quite understood it, haven't got it, deeply apologetic, and they're doing the right thing now. So we've applied the common sense principle to that. If we get
Mr. Operator, that can stop now. Premier, do you recall being aware of those remarks made by the then Chief Commissioner, Mr. Ashton?
I can't specifically recall whether I watched that press conference, but they seem familiar in terms of the statements that he made.
And what I want to suggest emerges from that is, firstly, at least in the sense of the evidence or the comments made by the Chief Commissioner, an observable improvement in compliance rates between the two sets of public remarks that he made. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, yes.
And suggesting that one of the key factors that was improving compliance was perhaps a level of greater understanding on the part of those who were meant to be quarantining about what their obligations were.
Yes.
Thank you. Thinking about some other, I'm sorry, Madam Chair, I should seek to tender that second recording, again, together with the transcript. The transcript document reference number is HQI.0001.0033.0066. May I tender the recording and transcript together?
221.
Thank you. Would I be right in understanding, Premier, that in addition to those specific remarks that Mr. Ashton had made, you were also aware in the period leading up to the 27th of March of a number of other issues that were arising as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic? Firstly, no doubt you were very aware of issues associated with the Ruby Princess and the way in which infection had reached the Australian community through that cruise ship.
Yes.
And I take it you were also aware at the time, in late March, of the very serious issues that other countries around the world were having in relation to widespread and poorly checked coronavirus infection.
Yes, Ms. Elliott.
And would I also be right in understanding that about this time, in the days leading up to the 27th of March, you were also aware of the economic impacts that the COVID restrictions already in place were having in Victoria? And in fact, I think you had announced on about the 20th of March a package of support for businesses that were affected by the restrictions that had become necessary.
Yes.
Thank you. May I direct your attention to paragraph 36 of your statement? In answer to a question that the board asked of you, you've indicated that as far as you're aware, there wasn't, as at the 27th of March, an existing plan for large-scale quarantining of the kind that ultimately occurred in Victoria.
Yes, that's correct.
And as I understand it from paragraph 11 of your statement, and I'm sorry to jump around, there wasn't any discussion in the Victorian Cabinet ahead of the National Cabinet decision about the prospect of such a wide-scale quarantine program being put in place?
Yes, that's right.
And as I understand the evidence that the board has received, other than some evidence of perhaps a high-level discussion to which Minister Makakos was party on the 26th of March, the evidence that the board's received is that no one, other senior ministers and senior public servants in the Victorian government weren't aware prior to the 27th of March that there was going to be, or that there might be, a hotel quarantine program. Are you aware that that's the evidence, Premier, that there doesn't seem to have been advance notice or knowledge on the part of the ministry or the public service that hotel quarantine might be coming down the line?
Yes, I'm aware of that evidence.
Yes. And does that accord with your understanding that there wasn't in fact any discussion or investigation of the possibility of a quarantine program of this scale prior to 27 March?
Yes.
It does appear from your statement and from the documents that the board has received that some work had been done in the days leading up to the 27th of March on the securing of hotel rooms. That's right, yes. And may I call please for a document, Mr. Operator, DPC.001.001.1422. And having gone to that document, Mr. Operator, could we go through to page .1425? This is a document that you've produced, Premier, and as we understand it, it's the relevant extract from a decision by the Expenditure Review Committee to allocate funds for the securing of hotel rooms. I'll ask that it be made a little larger, please, Mr. Operator, given the size of the text. Perhaps if we focus on the left-hand side of the page where the text is. So we see here, Premier, an $80 million accommodation package to support key workers and provide emergency accommodation to people in need. Yes, we do. And as I understand what's written there, it was proposed that the government would use the money that had been allocated to reserve up to 30% of current hotel rooms for a period of 3 months and negotiate appropriate arrangements. Yes. It's come to be known as the Hotels for Heroes program, I think, or formed part of a broader suite of COVID emergency accommodation. Yes, it has been referred in those terms. Yes, and we see in the green box there towards the right-hand side, there's a heading there to fiscal impact and a reference to it being of benefit to businesses. Yes. And would I be right in understanding that that was because it was recognised that funding allocation of this kind was going to serve a dual purpose, securing appropriate accommodation and supporting a sector that was particularly affected by coronavirus restrictions? Yes. Thank you, Mr. Operator. That can come from the screen. Prior to the 27th of March, Premier, had you been given any specific advice about the powers that were available to the Victorian government to detain people for the purposes of quarantine? I'm not certain that I had received any specific advice, Ms. Elliard, on that question, other than a general understanding of the provisions of the Public Health and Wellbeing Act. Thank you. Had you sought or received any specific advice on what would be involved in setting up a quarantine program beyond the rooms? So what I might call the broader logistics of such a proposal? No. Thank you. May I turn then to the question of how the decision for hotel quarantine came to, or designated locations quarantine came to be made, and perhaps direct your attention to paragraphs 12 and following in your statement, Premier. You refer in those paragraphs to receiving a brief on the morning of the 27th of March from the Department of Premier and Cabinet. And perhaps I'll ask if the relevant portion could be brought up, Mr. Operator. DPC.00001.0230, but then we'll go to 0231, please, Mr. Operator, in the document. As I understand it, Mr. Andrews, what you've produced here is the relevant extract from the briefing that you received ahead of the National Cabinet meeting that was to occur later that day. Yes. And I'll just ask that it be centred, Mr. Operator, so that we can ensure that we've got all of the information that's necessary. It appears that you were briefed about the possibility of a recommendation that some travellers self-isolate in hotels rather than going home.
Yes, that's right.
Indeed, the final dot point says it may recommend all travellers self-isolate if the household has more than one person.
That is correct, yes.
And then, thank you very much, Mr. Operator, that can come from the screen. And then, as I understand paragraph 13 of your statement, Premier, there was also provided to you a written advice from the AHPPC, which made a recommendation that consideration be given to requiring people to quarantine away from home in high risk cases.
Yes, that was the substance of it. Yes, Ms. Elliott.
And did you understand what was meant by the term high risk as it was used by the AHPPC?
I think there was some explanation as to that, but of course these would inform a meeting that would occur later on that day. I can't be certain that I had a precise understanding of what that term meant before the meeting.
Did you have your own views as at this time of what high risk meant if we're thinking about returned travellers coming from places where there might have been coronavirus infections?
Yes.
What was your own view of what we might describe people as high risk?
Anybody returning from a country with little or no public health response, community transmission, posed, in my judgment, a very serious risk, perhaps even an unacceptable risk for community transmission here. And I think the circumstance that we confronted at that time, with the vast majority of cases coming from overseas, that would have informed that view.
So that was your personal view that you held as at the 27th of March?
Yes.
Thank you. We've been provided with a copy of the relevant extract of the minutes of the National Cabinet meeting at which the decision was made. And you refer to this at paragraph 14 of your statement, but may I call up, please, Mr. Operator, DPC.0001.001.6117, but if we could go to .6123, Mr. Operator, in the document. Premier, this is the relevant extract from the minutes of the National Cabinet meeting on the 27th of March 2020.
It is.
And it speaks for itself, but relevantly, it provided that all travellers would be required to undertake mandatory self-isolation at designated facilities.
Yes, it did.
And that state powers would be used for the purposes of enforcing that mandatory self-isolation.
That is correct.
Having regard to your awareness of the work, thank you very much, Mr. Operator, that can come from the screen. Having regard to your pre-existing awareness of some work being done for the procuring of hotel rooms, did you have an assumption or an expectation after this decision was taken that the designated facilities in Victoria would be hotels?
I thought that most likely, Ms. Elliott, for a number of reasons. I'm happy to elaborate if you think that would be of assistance.
Yes. Why was, to the extent that you had the assumption that in Victoria we'd be using hotels, why was that?
Firstly, I'd been informed and had a general sense that there were the thousands of hotel rooms that would be required, as was referred to in the Cabinet document you brought up earlier. From the 20th, I believe, was the date of that meeting. And beyond that, it seemed logical that hotels would perhaps be the facility used, given travelling parties are made up of different numbers of people, so you'd need different size rooms, you'd need separate bathrooms for the purposes of infection control. Those sorts of factors, I think, were on my mind at that time. We hadn't settled the matter, but hotels did seem logical.
And when was the matter settled for Victorian purposes?
Well, I think I made announcements on the 28th. I believe that's when I made announcements about the final nature of things, or at least provided further details. And by that stage, I would recall that I think that the issue of hotels had been settled by then.
Okay. And I take it you may feel you've already said this, Premier, but one reason why hotels were a sensible option was that there were plenty of them available at this time, having regard to the limitations that had been placed on travel and tourism.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. At the time that you were party to or present for the decision of National Cabinet, did you have an understanding yourself of the enforcement power that would be used in Victoria to require people to remain in quarantine?
I can't specifically recall whether Ms. Elliott could point to a particular provision in the Act, but I suppose looking back on it, my assumption would have been those powers that were being used to essentially quarantine people in their homes.
Okay, so you assumed that it would be an extension of those powers under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act?
Yes, I think that would have been the assumption I made, yes.
Okay. And then perhaps I'll ask you the similar question about who was going to enforce or monitor compliance. At the time you were party to the decision or were aware that the decision had been made, did you have a view yourself about how those powers that were going to be exercised were going to be monitored and, where necessary, enforced?
No, I did not. That would not be a matter that I would turn my mind to.
You made some public remarks at about 3 o'clock on this day following a press conference that was given by the Prime Minister, and a transcript of your remarks has been tendered, and I'll ask that be brought up, please, Madam Chair. The document reference number is VPOL.006.002.0013. While that's being brought up, Premier, have you had the opportunity in the recent past to view a recording of what it was that you said on the 27th of March?
Yes, I have, Ms. Elliott.
Thank you. So can I draw your attention, and perhaps we'll bring up the bottom part of the page, please, Mr. Operator. You refer at about line 35 and following to the fact that from tomorrow night, you won't be quarantining at home on some honesty basis, you'll be quarantined with appropriate support at a hotel.
Yes.
And I take it that that reflects the assumption that we've been speaking about, that for the reasons you gave, it was your view even at that early stage that it would most likely be at a hotel.
Yes.
Thank you. If we could go over to the top of the next page, please, Mr. Operator. You refer to the fact that you'll be making fuller briefings in the future, but if I can draw your attention to the third line down towards the right-hand side, where you're recorded as having said, we've been working on this for quite some time, and you go on to speak about the resource that's available and the fact that it would not just be an appropriate health response, it would also be about repurposing and helping people back into work. When you said there, we've been working on this for quite some time, did you have in mind the work that had started as a result of the ERC submission and the $80 million?
Yes.
Did you have anything else in mind about the work that had been being done for the purposes of a quarantine program?
Not that I specifically recall, no.
Because the evidence that the board has received, and as we've touched on, is that in circumstances where the possibility of large-scale quarantine hadn't been canvassed before the 27th, there wasn't really much that had been done beyond the room allocations to prepare for the challenges of such a program. Would you accept that?
Yes, I would accept that.
Yeah. And so really what was confronting Victoria at that time was a very substantial logistical undertaking to stand up a complicated program within about 36 hours.
Yes, I think it could be fairly described as an unprecedented set of circumstances.
Yes. And so perhaps I'll ask you this, Premier, in those circumstances where beyond the availability of rooms and a sense of what the detention power would be, nothing yet had been planned. It's not a criticism, but nothing yet had been planned. I take it you were satisfied that it was feasible for it to be done?
Yes, I was.
And why were you satisfied that it could feasibly be done within the allocated time?
Well, having secured or having confidence that the rooms could be secured, it seemed to me that a dedicated team of people at that very much operational level Ms Elliard would be able to do as they had done many times before. They could rise to a challenge like this, and that they'd be able to stand the system up within the time frame.
Thank you. A little bit further down on the same page, around about line 15, if you look at the numbering on the far left-hand side, Premier, you're recorded as saying police, private security, all of our health team will be able to monitor compliance in a much easier way. And that's a reference to the fact that people will be in hotels. You've said already that at the time you participated in the decision, or were aware of the decision, you hadn't turned your mind specifically, or you don't believe you'd turned your mind specifically to who was going to be doing the enforcing. Does these remarks made by you at around 3 o'clock suggest that by that time you did have an assumption or an understanding of what the enforcement model would be?
I have given this quite some thought, Ms Elliard. I'm not certain why I mentioned police, private security and our health team, those three groups of people, and not a fourth or a fifth group. I think I go on shortly thereafter to talk about the fact that it had not been settled, but on the specifics, I can't clarify for you or outline for you why I chose those three groups. I'm afraid I have tried to search my recall of this, and I simply can't. I can't provide you with detail as to why they're mentioned and others aren't.
So I take it from that answer, Premier, that you can't recall what precisely was in your mind about the enforcement model, if I might use that expression, at the time you made these remarks.
Yes, I cannot recall that.
Thank you. That can come from the screen, Mr. Operator. I want to draw your attention, Premier, and indeed you may already be aware of some of this evidence, to some documents and evidence that the board has obtained about other people's understanding of what the enforcement model might be, or that might suggest a level of understanding. Firstly, could I call up, please, document DPC.0028.0001.0001? I understand, Premier, that this document has been provided to us as a text exchange passing between a member of your private office, who is the person writing the texts in grey, and Mr. Ada, who is a Deputy Secretary at the Department of Premier and Cabinet. I'll just give you a moment to read that, and then once you've read to the bottom, I'll ask for the next page where the text exchange continues.
Yes, I've read that, Ms Elliard.
Thank you. Mr. Operator, could we have the next page, please, so that we can see the rest?
Yes, I've read that, Ms Elliard.
Thank you, Premier. We'll go back to the first page, please, if we may, Mr. Operator. This, as I understand it, is, we can see the time stamping, it's 19 minutes past 1, which, as we understand from other evidence, would have been quite shortly after the conclusion of the National Cabinet meeting. Does that match your recollection?
Yes, it does.
And there's a reference here, we will need something on food and security for people in hotels. And the discussion goes on. It appears that it's partly about whether the program would start that day or the next day. But does this email, we will need something on food and security for people in hotels, suggest any decisions being made by you or in your private office about what the model was going to be?
I think my answer is no. I think it identifies that there's a need and that those matters have not yet been finalised. Not at that time anyway, Ms Elliard.
Would it have been within your private office that decisions of this kind would have been made about the model that was going to be adopted for the program?
No, they're very much of a, well, indeed, they're a deeply operational matter that would not be determined by my office or indeed by my department. I would say that would be out of character. We have emergency management structures and agencies for exactly those purposes.
Okay, so it does appear, though, that relevant matters, or what this member of your staff perceived as relevant matters, were being raised with Mr. Ada.
I think for the purposes of what I would be announcing, that's what I read this to mean, not so much to be determining them.
Thank you. There's a reference in the blue writing to Simon. Do you think it's likely that Simon might be a reference to Mr. Femister, the Secretary to the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions?
Yes, I think that's likely, more than likely.
Thank you, Premier. Thank you, Mr. Operator. That can come from the screen. I next want to draw your attention, Premier, to some text messages.
Looks like we might have lost the connection to Ms. Alliard. My apologies, Premier. If you just bear with us for a moment, I'm sure what will happen is Ms. Alliard will disconnect and then reconnect again. My apologies again, Premier. I'm just trying to establish as to whether or not it's likely to be a minute or two.
No problem, Madam Chair.
Thanks,
My apologies, Madam Chair. My apologies, Premier. It happened to me with Mr. Eccles and now you. I draw no inferences, but I deeply apologise.
No problem at all, Ms. Elliott.
Thank you. I was taking you to some documentation produced by Mr. Ashton, and could I ask that the document be brought up, please? It's VPOL.0005.001.0140. Mr. Ashton has given evidence that this was a text message that he sent to Mr. Eccles, the Secretary to the Department of Premier and Cabinet. The timestamping is 1:16, and it suggests by its content that Mr. Ashton had received some information about a proposal that would involve people being guarded by police. Are you aware at about this time, 16 minutes past 1, of any such proposal?
I'm sorry, Ms. Elliott. I'm trying to. Oh yes, I see it. Guarded by police for 14 days. So yes, that is what it seems he's saying. And no, I wasn't aware of a proposal at that time.
Okay, thank you. That could come from the screen, Mr. Operator, and could we have in its place VPOL.0004.005.0244? This is a text message exchanged between Mr. Ashton and Commissioner Kershaw of the Australian Federal Police. Just wait for it to come up. VPOL.0004.001.0244. Perhaps I'll put the content to you, Premier, while we're waiting. The text messaging suggests that within a very short period of time after the sending of that message that we've just looked at, Mr. Ashton had come into the possession of information suggesting that it would be private security guarding at the hotels. And it appears to have been informed or drawn an inference that that was an arrangement that had been made by the Department of Premier and Cabinet. If I can draw your attention to the second green box there, which is a text sent at 1:22. Perhaps I'll ask that it be enlarged a bit, please, Mr. Operator.
Yes, I can see that, Ms. Elliott.
Yes, and then a little bit further down, Mr. Operator, if we go to the further message in green, more toward the bottom of the page, there's a reference there at 1:32 to Mr. Ashton, apparently at that time having an understanding that it was a deal set up by the Department of Premier and Cabinet. Same question again. Are you aware of any such proposal having been agreed upon at about 1:30 that private security would be used for the purposes of enforcing mandatory self-isolation?
No, Ms. Elliott.
Are you aware of any circumstances that might have been a basis for Mr. Ashton to have received that information or received that impression that a decision had been made?
No, I'm not aware of anything personally that would have given rise to Graham Ashton drawing those conclusions.
Thank you.
No.
That can come from the screen, Mr. Operator. The board has received evidence, Premier, from Minister Neville and Mr. Ashton that they each had an understanding by about 2 o'clock when they were in a meeting with Mr. Crisp, the Emergency Management Commissioner, that there had been a decision taken already and that the decision was that private security would be used. Are you aware of that evidence that they've given?
Broadly, yes.
Yeah. And their evidence was not only that they were aware that a decision had been taken, but that they themselves had not been consulted about the proposal. They were rather presented with it as the decision that had been made. It'll be a matter for the board to consider whether or not to accept that evidence, but assuming that to be the case, does it strike you as unusual that a decision about enforcement would have been made without consulting the Chief Commissioner of Police or the Police Minister?
That would certainly not accord with custom and practice that I've observed throughout my time in public life and throughout my time as a Minister of the Crown and throughout my time as the Premier of this state. And indeed, it would, by reason of it being inappropriate, would you regard it as unlikely? I wouldn't necessarily. I'm not sure that I advance the notion that it was not appropriate. It would be out of character. It would not be the normal practice that I've certainly observed over a long period of time. Ms. Elliott, if I understand your question, would it be out of character? I think my question is, and perhaps I put words in your mouth, Premier. So firstly, I should ask you, do you think it's appropriate that a decision of that kind would be taken without consultation with the Chief Commissioner of Police? It certainly would be very unusual, unprecedented, I think, in some ways. I'm not sure that I'm in a position to make a value judgment about it, but by virtue of it not being regular practice, that would not be certainly from my point of view, that would not be the preferred way to set up a program like this. And so may I take it that, having regard to your experience, you would expect that ordinarily the views of the Chief Commissioner of Police would be sought before any decision was reached about the form of enforcement to be used in a program such as this? That's certainly my experience. And would you also say that a view once expressed would likely carry some weight in any decision making about what the enforcement model would be? Certainly, yes. Thank you. May I turn to a different set of questions about the reasons why the decision was taken and its implications, that being the decision to have a quarantine program? Yes. Would I be right in understanding that the objective of the program that was agreed to by National Cabinet was to prevent the
the transmission of infection from returned travellers to others in the community.
Yes.
And thinking particularly about Victoria, the purpose of implementing the program in Victoria was to prevent such transmission within Victoria.
Yes.
And it was your assessment, as I understand your statement, that at this time, on the 27th of March, you foresaw a significant risk to the Victorian community if returning travellers who were COVID positive transmitted the infection to contacts and beyond into the community.
Yes, I did.
Yeah. And it appears that that objective of preventing such transmission was proposed by National Cabinet to be dealt with by means of mandatory self-isolation in designated facilities.
Yes.
Did you yourself, on this day, give consideration to the possibility of other less extreme measures, such as, for example, beefing up the monitoring of people who were isolating at home?
I'm sure I would have turned my mind to those matters, Ms. Elliard, but I think in some respects the notion of having a very large group of people in a more concentrated environment would make compliance and enforcement from at least in a policy sense, an easier task. The other thing as well, of course, to note is that we couldn't be certain how many people that would, actual Victorians who were in Victoria, who had not travelled, who might become positive. So it seemed an appropriate response to a very significant risk at a time when we were trying to buy time to prepare our health system, and a time when we were expecting that things would unfold much like they had in some other parts of the world.
I understand. Thinking about the particular legislative context in Victoria where the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities provides for certain mechanisms and considerations, did you think about that particular Victorian context and the extent to which it might affect the way in which the National Cabinet decision could be implemented in Victoria?
No, I didn't turn my mind to the Charter, but many of the issues that are contemplated in the Charter would have been important to me, I think.
So would it be fair to say, and perhaps picking up the language of the press conference that we've looked at, that it was your assessment that it would be too risky to rely on people self-isolating on a, quote, honesty basis?
Yes.
It would be less risky to have a model of quarantine in designated facilities?
Yes.
And so I take from that your assessment was that rather than leaving responsibility for isolation and avoidance of transmission on individual travellers, the government would assume responsibility for ensuring isolation by requiring people to stay in particular places.
Yes.
So
I
the government.
I think that's not precisely what we decided, but I think that's a fair characterisation of what we did.
It's the effect of it. We're not going to place the responsibility on individuals. We're going to assume that responsibility. We'll give them somewhere to be and we'll keep them there.
Yes.
And so would you agree with me that then, having assumed responsibility for the risk that might otherwise be posed by infections, government also assumed responsibility for managing that risk in the quarantine setting?
Yes, I would absolutely agree with that.
Would you agree that the government assumed responsibility for making sure that people were at least as safe in the hotels as they would have been at home?
Yes.
And would you agree that the government assumed responsibility for ensuring that the community was at least as protected from infection risks as they would have been if people were isolating at home?
Yes, I think that's fair, yes.
Yeah. And would you agree that you've mentioned the benefits that flow in compliance terms, perhaps from people being in a large facility altogether, but putting a whole lot of people who may or may not have the disease in close proximity to each other creates its own risks too, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So the risk that they might expose each other to infection, for example?
Yes.
Or the risk that that the workers who are needed to come in to resource and manage a quarantine program might be exposed to infection.
Yes.
And what became clear was that this was a system that did require quite a large number of supports and a large number of people so as to make the program work.
Yes.
It was as the board understands it from all of the evidence we've received, a very complicated system.
Certainly a very large system, Ms. Elliard. As to arrangements and their complexity, I probably can't speak to that, but it was certainly a very big task. And whilst some of those risks can be mitigated, they are very, very significant issues.
Do you think on the 27th, when forming your own view that this was an appropriate process for Victoria, you had a sense of how large it was?
I think I did. We had some information about how many people had come back and some, at least, difficult to be definitive about exactly how many will come back, but we had some sense of that, and we thought we had the sufficient stock of rooms. Beyond that, I suppose I may well, in fact, I'm certain I would have left some of the risk mitigations we've just discussed to those at an operational level. I don't know that I would have turned my mind to those matters.
And so when I'm using the word large, I don't just mean number of rooms, but also large in the sense of all of the various logistical pieces that would need to be put together at an operational level.
Yes, I think that's a fair way to describe it, yes.
And would you agree that, having regard to the fact that the government had decided to take on this approach and quarantine people, the government from the 27th of March had the responsibility to identify and plan for all of those risks that we've been talking about?
Yes.
Would you also agree with me that a hotel-based quarantine model is costly? It's costly in human and in dollar terms?
Yes, it is.
Costly in the sense that it's a very significant imposition on those who are required to go into the program.
Yes, it is.
And with potentially significant limitations on their capacity to go about their ordinary lives, and the potential for any pre-existing vulnerabilities to be exacerbated. So it's costly in the sense of the demands that it places on people.
Yes, it is.
But it's also expensive in dollar terms when one considers the cost of hotel rooms and the costs of all the other ancillary services that are required to make the program work.
Yes, it is a considerable expense.
Would we be right in understanding from the press conference that you gave on the 27th of March that, at least to some extent, the cost, particularly the cost of hotel rooms, was one of the reasons why this was a good option, because it was going to be making use of the hotel rooms and potentially providing some work for people who'd been displaced by COVID restrictions?
Ms. Elliard, you, I think, spoke in terms of perhaps multiple benefits earlier on. So I think that there was potentially and likely a multiple benefit. The other point I would make is, as I look back on that time, even at $80 million, which is a substantial amount of money, the costs associated both in lives, liberties and finances of widespread community transmission and this wildly infectious virus running as it had in so many other parts of the world, I dare say they were considerable factors for me and for us at the time as well.
Of course, you've explained the reason why you were doing it, because you saw the substantial risks posed by the infection, but it would also appear, not just from the remarks you made on the 27th, but from the way submissions were made to the Crisis Council of Cabinet, that the possibility of serving two purposes, both the protective purpose and the supportive purpose for business, both of those were considerations in the mind of those who made submissions to the Cabinet, and no doubt in the minds of those who considered those submissions.
Yes.
So, for example, if one goes to a submission that was made to the Crisis Council of Cabinet on the 8th of April, Mr. Operator, that's document DPC.0012.0001.0733. And if once we're there, we go to the second page, please. Firstly, just to orient you, Premier, I'm sure you receive a lot of these, but we can understand this as a document which, as a member of the Crisis Council of Cabinet, you would have received.
Yes.
And this is a document that we know from other materials, in particular, the red summary document prepared for you relates to a Crisis Council of Cabinet meeting on the 8th of April 2020. So you know where we are in the process. We see on the second page, and perhaps if we could bring up the heading objectives, Mr. Operator. We see there two objectives. The first one's the protection of public health, and the second, the supporting of the continued viability of the tourism and accommodation industry.
Yes.
Yes, and thank you. That can come from the screen. And then if we go a couple of months later to a document that was put to the Crisis Council on the 4th of June, could we have please document DPC.0012.0001.0356? And again, if we go to page 2, please. And if we bring up the objectives section first, we see there again, there's a third objective now, but the first two objectives relate to public health and crucial support to the tourism accommodation sector and retaining local jobs.
Yes, that's correct, Ms. Elliott.
So the hotel quarantine program, and indeed the broader coronavirus emergency accommodation program, of which hotel quarantine was a substantial part, had these dual benefits, as you saw it.
Yes.
And it's, thank you very much, that can come from the screen. And perhaps it's trite to say, but a home-based isolation model wouldn't have had those dual benefits, would it?
No.
And would you agree with me that the economic benefits of the hotel-based model, it's not the only reason you did it, but the economic benefits were an important feature of the program in terms of the overall benefit that you saw Victoria would receive?
I would always see them, Ms. Elliott, as secondary to the public health objective. That I think is, the answer to your question is yes, it's important, but it is absolutely secondary in my mind and in my judgment. The public health imperative was the principal objective, and the second benefit was subordinate to that.
So you wouldn't accept the proposition that they were of equal weight, the protection and the economic support?
No, Ms. Elliott, far from equal.
Thank you, Premier. I'm going to turn to a new topic now, which is about the extent to which you became familiar with or had an awareness of the structure, the operational structure of the program. You've given evidence that largely that would have been matters for other people. But I take it from paragraph 1 and 2 of your statement that you're aware that the program was established as an operation called Operation Soteria.
Yes, I am.
Do you think you knew the name at the time, or is that something you've become aware of since as matters relating to the Board of Inquiry have unfolded?
I couldn't be certain, Ms. Elliott. These are computer-generated names. There are many different operations going on. I do my best to stay abreast of them, but I couldn't tell you whether I knew at the time that it was specifically referred to by that name.
Are you able to recall what level of briefing you received about the way the structure had been established and who was doing what?
Certainly ahead of my announcements in the immediate aftermath of National Cabinet, that 28th, I think, is the appropriate date, where we spoke in more detailed terms. I would have been briefed on decisions that had been made by that time. Beyond that, I can't point to a specific document or specific meeting, but logic tells me that must have occurred because I made announcements to that end on the 28th.
Do you think the documentation or briefings that you received would have gone into detail about, for example, which agency or agencies were taking responsibility for the establishment and maintenance of the program?
I would expect, if we're speaking about agencies rather than rather than departments, Ms. Elliott? Is that?
Thank you for the correction. I should say department. Which departments were involved?
Not a correction. I just wanted to be clear on what I was being asked.
No, departments.
Departments. I might have had some sense of departmental arrangements, but I think agency arrangements, I would not necessarily be briefed specifically on that. It might come forward perhaps as something that the State Control Centre had done, maybe trying to, if you like, grouping together different agencies.
So, for example, you say later at a certain point in your statement who you understood to be the agency that had the control agency responsibility under emergency management arrangements. Do you recall when or how you became aware that there was a control agency with responsibility for this particular operation, namely the hotel quarantine program?
Beyond my statement, I can't speak necessarily to, as I said, a specific document. And I suppose it relates to the time frame. Very early on, I can't speak to that, but then these matters became formalised as they were the subject of cabinet submissions, the one you've just taken me to, I think, from the 8th.
Yes. So I'm going to take you to a document and ask you if you recall seeing it or any earlier iterations of it. May I call, please, Madam Chair, for document DOJ.501.001.9224. Premier, this is a version of the Operation Soteria plan. It has a date of the 26th of April 2020. Just showing you the front page there, Premier. Are you able to say whether this is a document that you've seen before?
I don't believe I've seen that document before, Ms. Elliott.
As we go through the pages, one sees that it's a document that sets out with some detail the way in which roles and responsibilities have been apportioned between departments for the purposes of the hotel quarantine program. Would you ordinarily expect to receive documentation of this kind in your capacity as the Premier?
No, I wouldn't. And my point of reference, I suppose, Ms. Elliott, would be that I don't believe that I would have received documentation of this kind, even for a bushfire. I don't believe, thinking back across the summer, I don't believe I would have seen a document of this nature.
Okay. Thank you. Can we go through to page within that document 9229? So .9229, please, Mr. Operator. I'm drawing your attention to the section in the document dealing with governance, Premier, and I'm conscious that you've said that you don't believe you've seen this and it isn't a category of documents that you would ordinarily expect to receive. But we see there, perhaps we'll make it a little bit larger, Mr. Operator, for the benefit of everybody's eyes. If we can focus on the governance section, 2.1.
Yes.
There's a reference there to the operation being led by the Deputy State Controller working to the State Controller Health to give effect to the decisions and directions of the Public Health Commander and the Enforcement and Compliance Commander. And there's also reference to support agencies. Thinking about your experience in other kinds of emergencies, including bushfires, Premier, are you aware in general terms of the concept of control agency and support agency for emergency management purposes?
Yes, Ms. Elliott.
So they're terms that have significance for you. You understand that there's a relevant distinction between them?
Yes.
Thank you. If we go to the next page in the heading 2.2, organisational structure. We see there, thank you very much, Mr. Operator, that's perfect. We see there a document setting out the organisational structure as at the time of this document, the 26th of April. And we see on the right-hand side a chain of command or reporting, or a chain, perhaps I'll call it neutrally, with the Emergency Management Commissioner at the top, the State Controller Health, and then the Deputy State Controller for Operation Soteria.
Yes, I can see that.
And then across to towards the left-hand side, there's the COVID Accommodation Commander, DHHS, and there's a link with dotted lines to Enforcement and Compliance, and then on to Public Health Commander and up towards the Chief Health Officer.
Yes.
So assuming this represents the structure that was in place, there isn't a direct line, for example, between the Chief Health Officer and the State Controller. There's a mechanism linking them, but this doesn't appear on its face to contemplate a direct line between those two positions.
No, it doesn't.
And are you aware, Premier, of the State Health Emergency Response Plan for Victoria?
I am certainly in broad terms.
Yeah. And are you aware that one of the features of that plan is what I'm going to call a presumption or an assumption, although by no means a hard and fast rule, that in the case of a health emergency, it would be the Chief Health Officer who is the State Controller for Health?
I am aware of that presumption, as you put it, yes.
Yeah, and you're also aware that wasn't the approach that was taken for the purposes of the public health emergency in Victoria this year. Someone else was appointed as the State Controller for Health.
Yes.
And are you aware of the opinion of the Chief Health Officer, which he's given to the board in the course of his evidence, that in his view it would have been appropriate, or I think his words might have been not inappropriate, for him to have been the State Controller Health?
Ms. Elliott, I'm aware of that evidence. I'm aware of that view now. I was not aware of that at the time when I think these matters were live, as it were.
And of course, one obvious effect of the Chief Health Officer being the State Controller for Health is that he would have had a direct role being reported to and with the capacity to deal directly with the person holding the position of Deputy State Controller for Operation Soteria.
You could certainly argue that, yes.
Yes, thank you. Could we go down to the bottom of that page, please, and the heading 2.3, Mr. Operator? At the very bottom, there's 4 dot points there which spell out what the DHS Commander COVID-19 accommodation is responsible for. And you might recall, Premier, from the diagram at the top, that's the link in the chain across then towards where public health sits. And there are those 4 dot points there. Is that consistent with your understanding that DHHS in Operation Soteria, whether particularly through this role or more generally, had those responsibilities in the dot points?
Yes, certainly at that point in time, I would think so, yes.
And I'm aware, and we'll come in, I'm sorry, I'm aware that later on arrangements changed.
Yes.
But thinking about late April 2020, these matters rested with DHHS?
I can't be certain, Ms. Elliott, I'm just trying to be as accurate as I possibly can be. I can't be certain that that's an exhaustive list of the things that the entire department did. But
no, and I don't suggest that it is, but it's an inclusive list of their responsibilities.
Yes.
Including relevantly the 3rd dot point, ensuring a safe detention environment at all times.
Yes.
As we understand the evidence, Premier, one of the changes that was made to government and ministerial arrangements to reflect the demands of the COVID-19 pandemic was not just the reorganisation of Cabinet to form the Crisis Council of Cabinet, but a corresponding change in the way in which the secretaries of departments were given responsibilities and reported on those responsibilities as they related to COVID-19.
Yes.
And we understand that was called the mission, I've gone back, the EMCC.
Yes.
Yeah. And you were, by reason of that arrangement, being reported to directly by a number of mission leads within departments, as well as them having a reporting line to their own minister. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
And in that capacity, the special arrangements that were in place for COVID-19, would you have expected, or did you receive a higher degree of operational detail about matters relating to COVID-19 response than you would ordinarily get as Premier?
No, those arrangements didn't alter the fundamental division between those matters that the executive would normally deal with and those deeply operational matters that are appropriately dealt with by others.
So although you had a more direct line to some secretaries and they had a more direct line to you, that wouldn't have altered the extent to which you were given operational information about how, particularly for our purposes, the quarantine program was being run?
No.
So would you have received such information, for example, as decisions having been made about which hotels to use?
I don't believe so, no.
Would you have received information about decisions that had been made to allocate a particular hotel as a place which would be called a hot hotel at which everyone who tested positive would be located?
I don't believe so. I certainly have no recall of a specific document or a briefing to that matter. I was aware of those arrangements, but that may well be that I've become aware of it rather than it being put to me almost to say yes or no to that sort of arrangement. Secretaries are all employed by me, they're appointed by me, and they're already accountable. This was about trying to streamline some of that, but it didn't change the types of things that secretaries would ordinarily be accountable to me for.
Thank you. That can come from the screen, Mr. Operator. I want to turn to ask you some questions about contracting arrangements at a fairly high level, Premier. The evidence that the board's received is that the state government, through the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions, entered into a number of contracts for the purposes of the hotel quarantine program. May I assume that at least at a high level you're familiar with that fact?
Yes.
And indeed, in particular, contracts were entered into firstly with hotels for accommodation.
I believe so, yes.
And then also with security providers for the purposes of private security services.
Yes.
And also with cleaning companies for the purposes of cleaning.
Yes.
And would you agree with me that those are three key components of the hotel quarantine program, where people will be required to stay, who's going to make sure they stay there, and who's going to make sure that it's a clean and infection-free environment for them?
Yes.
And would you agree with me that all three of those components were necessary because this was a hotel quarantine model? They wouldn't have been components that were necessary in the same way if we were using a home isolation model.
Yes.
And are you aware, perhaps even at a very general level, that the contracts with hotels and the contracts with security companies placed responsibility on the contractors for matters relating to correct and sufficient use of personal protective equipment and training for staff on infection prevention and control?
I'm certainly aware of that now, Ms. Elliard. I couldn't speak to whether I was at the time, but yes, the answer to the question is yes.
Yeah, and the evidence that the board has received is from just looking on the face of the contracts, those responsibilities relating to PPE and staff understanding, infection control and so forth, they were outsourced by government to those private contractors, if you just look at the bare face of the contracts.
I think that's a fair statement, yes.
Yeah. And assuming that to be the case, there'd be a very substantial risk associated with that, wouldn't there? By which I mean a risk to the success of the program that such matters had been outsourced.
Yes.
Because, again, it's probably trite to say, but if this was set up as an infection prevention program, it depended on having proper and sufficient infection prevention and control measures.
Yes.
Now, you may be aware that there's been differing views presented to the board about whether or not it was just the bare contractual arrangements or whether or not there was other responsibilities assumed by departments of the state and the extent to which they fulfilled those additional obligations if they existed, and those would be matters for the board to decide. But would you agree with me that these issues of infection control were too important to be left entirely to private contractors?
I think, yes, I think I can agree with that statement. Given what's at stake, given the seriousness and the infectivity of this virus, Ms. Elliard, I think that's a fair statement, yes.
Because, I mean, contractual remedies after the fact would hardly be enough if by reason of a contractual failure, the infection got out and spread in the community.
Yes, those proceedings are of not much use against this virus.
And so perhaps thinking about what we talked about before, this is an instance, isn't it, of the government having assumed the risk by bringing people into the program and the government needing to retain appropriate responsibility for the management and mitigation of that risk.
Yes.
And so you'd agree with me that if it was the case that the state, through relevant departments, didn't take an active role and in ensuring that there was proper infection control and prevention measures in place, that would be a matter of great concern.
Absolutely.
Thank you. May I turn then to a few more questions about your knowledge of how the enforcement mechanisms worked? And I'm directing your attention to paragraph 41 and following of your statement, Premier, if that assists you. Are you able to recall when you became aware that the front line of enforcement for the program being put in place was going to be private security guards rather than some other mechanism?
Ms. Elliott, I can't point to a specific meeting or document, but I'll take you back to my answer earlier. I announced these arrangements, at least in broad terms, on the 28th. So I must have been informed of those final decisions prior to then.
Okay. Do you recall whether or not you had an opinion at the time you became aware of it about the appropriateness or otherwise of that frontline enforcement role being given to private security?
No, I don't believe. Although I can't speak to whether I did that. That is some time ago, and I've no recall of having a specific view one way or the other.
Okay, thank you. Could I ask that a document be called up, please? HQI.0001.0027.0001. And while that's being brought up, Premier, would I be right in understanding that you've been made personally aware in the past of concerns in sections of the community and sections of the private security industry about that industry and how it operates?
Yes.
And indeed, you had previously committed to the conducting of a review of the regulatory and licensing arrangements for the private security industry?
Yes.
And that's a commitment that was made in 2018, but I've had brought up on the screen an issues paper that was prepared by the Department of Justice and Community Safety this year. I think its date is June or early July, which is the issues paper inviting comment and responses to the inquiry that has been established. Are you aware of this document?
I am, yes.
Yeah, and I take it from that you're also aware that the inquiry which you had previously foreshadowed is presently open and receiving submissions.
Yes, I am.
Thank you. I just want to take you to a couple of points in this document. Could we move forward, please, Mr. Operator, to page 23 of the document? So that's 0023. The document sets out, does it not, for the purposes of inviting discussion and response, Premier, a number of issues that have been raised as potential issues requiring investigation or action. Doesn't include conclusions about them, it raises concerns for discussion and future analysis. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair.
And one of them is about the quality of training and assessment practices for those who are going to be licensed as private security guards, and we see a reference to some discussion on the page that's up there.
Yes.
Then if we go over 2 pages, please, Mr. Operator, to page 0025, a separate issue that's been raised that's referred to at the bottom half of the page is concerns about literacy and numeracy skills amongst those who've been licensed as private security guards. And yes, in particular, the question of language skills, by which I understand them to mean language skills in the English language.
Yes, I can see that there's a series of questions posed to that end, yes.
Yes. Then if we go over to page 0030, please, Mr. Operator. There's a heading there, industrial relations issues, and over the succeeding pages, a number of separate issues that had been plainly brought to the attention of those preparing this paper about the basis on which security guards are engaged and the existence of sham contracting or otherwise unfair arrangements for those working as security guards?
Yes.
And I take it that at a high level, you were aware of those concerns and they sat behind your decision that a review of this kind should occur?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Could we just look at 0033? A particular issue still under the industrial relations heading related to the underpayment of wages and superannuation. I take it you were aware that that was one of the issues that was or is of concern to some sections of the industry and the community.
Yes.
And over the page, please, Mr. Operator, to 0034, concerns about cash in hand payments as a feature of the industry. That was a concern, I take it, that you were aware of in general terms.
In general terms, yes.
Of course. And similarly, concerns about the widespread use of casual labour hire under the heading of job security towards the bottom of that page.
Yes.
You're aware of that in general terms.
Yes.
And indeed, there had been a separate labour hire inquiry, had there not, which had included in its final report issues about the issue of insecure work and the practice of subcontracting in a range of industries, not just security.
Yes.
Thank you. That can come from the screen. Premier, the evidence that the board has received is that the hotel quarantine program required and used literally thousands of private security guards. Are you aware of that?
I have become aware of that evidence, yes.
And the evidence is that a very substantial majority of them were engaged via subcontracting arrangements underneath head contractors. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
And are you aware of the evidence that the security guards were called upon to perform a number of tasks, including, for example, carrying luggage of guests who were arriving or leaving and who may or may not have been COVID positive, escorting guests for fresh air walks in circumstances where they may or may not have been COVID positive, and moving through areas of the hotel that were common areas that could be also used by people who may or may not have been diagnosed or be at risk of having coronavirus? Are you aware of that evidence about the general nature of the duties that security guards performed?
Yes, I am.
There's a substantial risk to the success of this program as an infection control program, I suggest to you, that's associated with such heavy reliance on a private security workforce, having regard to some of the issues that arise about that workforce and how they're hired and remunerated. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think that's a fair conclusion to draw.
And again, that's a risk that particularly arose because of this being a hotel-based rather than home-based quarantine mechanism.
Yes.
And so would you agree that it was a risk for the government to manage as part of, and I'm quoting from paragraph 43 of your statement, Premier, it was a risk for the government to manage as part of its response to a public health emergency caused by a highly infectious virus?
Yes.
Thank you. On the topic of how work was done in the program, may I ask you some questions, please, about the extent to which you were aware of the availability of the ADF to assist Victoria in its coronavirus responses? And I can direct your attention to paragraph 46 and following in your statement where you answer some questions about this. Firstly, perhaps generally, and by reference to the experience that you'd had in other emergencies, including bushfires, I take it that you're aware in a general sense, Premier, of the variety of roles that can be played by the ADF where they're made available to support emergency management responses and planning in Victoria.
Yes.
And indeed, as I understand the evidence from Mr. Crisp, partly by reason of the bushfire summer, ADF officers have been present in the State Control Centre and assisting, particularly in relation to strategy and planning since the bushfire period.
Yes, I think I first requested them to assist us between Christmas and New Year. I think they've been here for quite some time, some of them.
And at paragraph 47, you make the point that your awareness about the potential availability of the ADF to assist, particularly with the quarantine proposal, was that availability would be where it was necessary and according to need. Is that right?
Yes.
And so that's got two components. Firstly, if it was needed in the relevant state.
Yes.
And then secondly, it's a finite resource. So if there were multiple demands, it was going to be apportioned according to who needed it the most. Was that your understanding?
Yes.
I tendered before you started your evidence today, Premier, a document that's a register of the requests for assistance that were made by the Emergency Management Commissioner to the Commonwealth for ADF assistance in relation to what I'll call generally COVID-19 responses. Is that a document that you've seen?
No, I don't believe I have.
Mr. Crisp gave evidence that there were multiple requests made by him for varying forms of assistance from the ADF to assist Victoria in its COVID-19 response. Are you aware in general terms that requests were made by him?
Yes.
And that requests were granted by the Commonwealth and various forms of ADF support was provided to assist Victoria in its COVID-19 responses?
Yes.
You say at paragraph 49 and 50 of your statement that you're not yourself aware of offers being made by the ADF. The board has heard evidence that on the 27th of March, in the initial planning meeting that occurred at the State Control Centre, there was some discussion about the extent to which the ADF would play a role, and the Emergency Management Commissioner, Mr. Crisp, says, and gave evidence that this was his view, that he didn't see that on-the-ground ADF assistance was required at that time. Are you aware of that?
Only insofar as I'm aware of the evidence he's given. What was required was not something that I would have been determining, which I think is the sequence of events that you're describing.
Okay. So I take it that, yes, you're aware now that he's given that evidence. You weren't aware at the time that he had that view?
No, I don't believe I was.
Yeah. But do you accept that his evidence is that he did have the view that in the context of being aware of the possibility of seeking support if it was needed and necessary, he formed the view that it wasn't necessary at that time?
Yes.
Thank you. I want to now ask you about your knowledge of some contact occurring between Mr. Eccles of your department and Mr. Gaetjens, his counterpart at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. May I call up, please, Mr. Operator, document DPC.0014.001.004. And I'll perhaps give you some context, Mr. Andrews, but firstly I'll ask you, have you seen these emails before?
I have seen them only in preparing for my evidence today.
Thank you. So Mr. Eccles' evidence is that the context of the email at the bottom, the email to him from Mr. Gaetjens, was a telephone conversation that he recalls that he had, in which he made an inquiry about the potential availability of Commonwealth funds to assist with the costs of private security. So his evidence is that that's the context of a conversation that ranged perhaps over other areas, but included that request. And in response to that request, he received the email that we see there, in which Mr. Gaetjens is recorded as saying that New South Wales were receiving ADF personnel, and that he had a view that the Commonwealth would assist in Victoria in a similar way if you wanted to reconsider your operating model. So I take it, Premier, that you weren't aware of this email until you were shown it in preparation for your appearance today.
Yes.
Were you aware of its contents in the sense of a discussion having occurred between Mr. Eccles and Mr. Gaetjens about the potential way in which the Commonwealth would contribute to the costs of security in the hotel quarantine program?
No.
In particular, were you aware that there was, well, I should pause there. Mr. Eccles accepted from me that an inference open to be drawn is that the reference to reconsider your operating model is a reference to an operating model that doesn't include ADF. So perhaps to assist you in answering my next question, Mr. Eccles accepted that that's the inference, that the discussion is about a change to a model from one that doesn't include ADF to one that does. Assuming that's what the conversation was about, I take it from your answers that you weren't aware that that discussion had occurred?
No, I was not aware of that.
Were you aware about the proposition that ADF personnel might have been available if Victoria elected to adopt a model that required them in hotels?
No, I had quite the opposite view.
You had the view that they weren't available?
Again, if it's useful to give you some context, I'm happy to do that. Well,
firstly, but just so you had a view that they weren't available. That
yes.
was your view.
And
the reason for your view?
Well, and again, I stress this is not as a point of criticism, but leaving the National Cabinet meeting, I had absolutely no expectation whatsoever that in the establishment and the running of hotel quarantine, there would be significant, extensive ADF support. That was not the case for every state. A case I think had been well made in relation to New South Wales, but I had no expectation at all that we would receive that type of support. And these matters, some week or so later, were not drawn to my attention. In fact, it's the first time I'm seeing this email. I was in prep for this.
So Mr. Eccles' evidence was that he couldn't recall whether or not he had, well, firstly, I should note that it appears from the face of this document that Mr. Eccles just responded with thanks to Mr. Gaetjens. Mr. Eccles' evidence was that he couldn't recall whether he did or didn't do anything with this information, and that he hadn't been able to find any document by way of an email exchange or anything that would demonstrate that he did do something with it. So that's the evidence Mr. Eccles has given. Would you have ordinarily expected that the availability of a resource of this kind from the ADF would have been drawn to your attention?
Yes.
Would you have ordinarily expected that it would have been drawn to the attention of those who were making policy and operational decisions for the structure of the hotel quarantine program?
Yes, I would think so.
Do you feel able to express any view on what use you personally might have made of this information had you been aware of it at the time?
It's difficult, Ms. Elliard, for me to speculate on what I might have done with it, but what I think I can comment on is that given that it's so at odds with what I took away from the National Cabinet meeting, I think it would have been very significant to me. And I can't predict what outcome it might have had, but I certainly would have wanted to know, because it would have presented us with options that we otherwise didn't have in a good faith interpretation, very clear interpretation of what had been decided at National Cabinet. And
amongst other things, and again, I think Mr. Eccles agreed with this proposition, what appears to have been contemplated by Mr. Gaetjens as being available was personnel for whom the Commonwealth would bear financial responsibility.
Yes.
They would pay them.
Yeah, it would be an in-kind arrangement, yes.
Yes. And thus, if they were used, potentially reducing the extent to which Victoria was incurring the costs of private security.
Well, all I'd say is I can't presuppose what role they would have played, but it would be open, I think, to conclude that they might have played some of those functions. I'm not sure, and I can't determine from this email whether they would have been additional to the operating model or whether they might have taken the place of people who were in the operating model. But it's additional support. We could certainly agree on that, I think.
Thank you. That can come from the screen, Mr. Operator, and I'll call up a different document, which is dpc.0014.0001.0006. And whilst that's coming up, Premier, may I ask you whether you have any recollection of having a conversation with the Prime Minister, Mr. Morrison, on the 23rd of June, 2020?
Yes, I do.
And there's a reference in the in the email that we see here from Mr. Eccles to you having had such a discussion on the previous night, which is the 23rd of June. it appears from the balance of this email, and Mr. Eccles' evidence was that he sent this email by way of a follow-up to a discussion that you and Mr. Morrison had about the possibilities of supports being made available. Is that consistent with your recollection about what the discussion between you and the Prime Minister was?
Yes, it is.
I'll perhaps give you a moment to read the email, and I'll ask that it be made a bit larger for that purpose to see whether it matches your recollection, perhaps at a high level only, of the matters that you and the Prime Minister had discussed.
I am familiar with this this matter. All the matters that I discussed with the Prime Minister, to the best of my memory, we did not discuss hotel quarantine, I don't believe. We certainly discussed other matters which are outlined. I can't be certain if that's an absolutely exhaustive list, but they are the matters that we talked about. And I think that, well, again, if you want my view on where the other items came from, I can provide that, but I'm trying to be as clear as I can. I spoke about, I think, all of these issues, with the exception of the topic of hotel quarantine, was not something, I don't believe I spoke to the Prime Minister about that. Okay, thank you. So you're referring to the heading that's towards the bottom of that page, which says security support services for hotel operations. And there's a reference there to some support. And if we go over to the next page, please, Mr. Operator, there's a figure given of the number of, just a bit further up, there's a figure given of between 50 and 100 personnel for the purpose. And so as I understand it, Premier, you don't have a recollection of raising with the Prime Minister the specific issue of support for the hotel quarantine program? To the best of my recollection, I don't believe I did. I'm not making a judgment about the request. It's not accurate, I think, for me to say that everything in the letter was the subject of the discussion. I don't think that matter was something that we talked about. Thank you. That can come from the screen. The evidence before the board is that that request, which was foreshadowed by Mr. Eccles, was subsequently made in a formal way by the Emergency Management Commissioner according to the ordinary processes. And he made a request for a number of forms of assistance, and one of them was for 850 ADF personnel to work in the hotels. Firstly, are you aware that that's the evidence that he's given, that he made formal requests and that one of them was for 850 people? Yes, I am. And his evidence was that that figure was reached because of an assessment by DHHS and a request by DHHS to him that they seek ADF support to replace the private security guards who, as at that date, 24 June, were still working in the hotel quarantine program. Are you aware of that? Yes. I understand from your statement that you did become aware of that particular request having been made and its purpose. Are you able to recall when and how you became aware of it? I became aware of it the following day, which I think was my office drew my attention to this matter after there had been media reports. So I think I'm drawing your attention to about paragraph 54 and 55 of your statement, Mr. Andrews, if that assists your recollection. The 20, I'm sorry, which paragraphs, Ms. Elliott? 55, 54 and 55. Yeah. Yes, I became aware the day after. This is the 850 we're referring to, Ms. Elliott, yes? Yes, that's right. I became aware of it the day after the request was made. And you had a view about it, as I understand it? Yes, I did. And what was that view? The program was in the process of being reset. There were, as my statement outlines, there had been outbreaks. There was a need for us to re-examine the model. And the government was actively considering which workforce would be appropriate. The ultimate decision was to have supervision by Corrections Victoria. And it just seemed that there had been a disconnect between a process that was being run by the executive with input from departments and the requests that Commissioner Crisp had put in. Although the evidence is that he put in that request at the request of the Department of Health and Human Services. Do you accept that? I couldn't comment on whether that's accurate or otherwise. I have no knowledge of that.
Okay. And the evidence before the board is that around about the same time that the request was rescinded, it was granted. So the evidence is that had the request not been rescinded, the services of the 850 ADF members would have been made available to Victoria. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware that that is the case. So on or about, well, toward the end of June, they might well have been available.
Yes, but the decision was taken that they wouldn't be used because, as you've said, of a decision to reset with a different workforce.
Yes.
Again, the 850 would have been provided as in-kind support without any financial commitment by Victoria. That's so, isn't it?
I understand so, although it's hard to make a judgment about that, Ms. Elliott. As I understand it, this would be a short-term measure or interim measure. I'm not quite sure of the exact wording of the request, but that was my understanding.
So your understanding was, and I think the documents support that, to the extent that the ADF personnel were provided for this function, it would have been as an interim matter pending the transfer to a new workforce.
Yes, and yes, it is, and I think, and you're correct, I think, to assume that it would be an in-kind arrangement. Yes. Yeah.
It would still have been useful though, whilst these substantial changes are being made to reset with a different longer-term workforce, to avail ourselves of the support that was being offered from the ADF. Do you accept that?
Not necessarily, Ms. Elliott. I think that relates to how quickly the reset can be put in place. Many of these ADF members would in fact be reservists or people that were not stationed in Victoria. There would be some time involved. Again, not criticism, but there would be some time involved. I think this was superseded by events, Ms. Elliott.
And those events being the reset to the use of corrections staff that the board has heard about?
Yes.
Thank you. Can I turn to a different topic, Premier, although at the same time it's also returning to a topic we've already discussed, which is about the decision about private security. You may be aware that the board has heard from multiple witnesses about the fact that private security became and were the first line of enforcement, and that there's considerable disagreement amongst those various witnesses about when and by whom that decision was made. Are you familiar in general terms with the nature of the evidence that the board has received?
Yes, Ms. Elliott, I am.
And the evidence is to the effect that no one's claiming ownership of the decision, even though no one seems to have spoken against it at the time, and no one who might have been the decision maker seems to suggest that if it had been them, it would have been a bad decision. There's just no one who says it was them. You're aware of that?
I am.
Do you know who it was?
No, I don't. That's the nature of the decision I made. That's why I set up this board of inquiry, or recommended to the governor to set up this board of inquiry, to get exactly that answer and quite a few others, Ms. Elliott.
Because we really should know, shouldn't we? We should be able to say who made a decision to not only spend that much money, but to give such an important function in this infection control program.
Yes, it's one of a number of very important questions. Yes.
Mr. Eccles, in his evidence, when I asked him a similar question, suggested that this might be, and I'm sure I'm not doing justice to his answer, but I understood him to say that this might be an example of what he called collective governance or collective decision making. Do you have a view about whether that's what happened here in relation to private security?
Well, I'd only be offering an opinion if that would be useful to the board.
Yes, if you think that what happened here was collective decision making,
I think it's incredibly
we would be pleased.
Ms. Elliott, I want good and the best decision making, and I think it's very difficult to make judgments about that unless you can point to who made it. I don't know that this. I don't. My understanding of collective decision making does not remove accountability. It does not remove, for instance, as the chair of the cabinet the Cabinet makes a collective decision, but I have made that decision because I am the chair of that Cabinet. If a group of people meet and a decision is made, then a similar formality ought be born to those processes, come to those processes as well. That's at least my practical experience from the many, many meetings and different forums that I'm the chair of. I don't think collective decision-making makes it harder to determine what body and which people made a judgment, made a decision. That's why those forums have a record of decision and minutes and a degree. They're an authorising environment.
So to pick up on your point, Premier, Cabinet's an obvious example of group decision-making, but everyone who's there understands that that's what they're doing. They're participating in a group decision-making process.
That is correct, yes. That is
and
correct.
they're all able to say afterwards, yeah, I was part of that. I was part of that decision-making. Yes,
and furthermore, at a subsequent meeting, if the decision were not recorded accurately, if you had a different view, if your participation was not recorded accurately, then you have opportunities to correct the record. There's a formality to that, even though it's collective.
So here, assuming that Mr. Eccles' analysis is correct and this was an instance of collective decision-making, one would expect those who were part of the collective to know that they were and to be able to identify themselves as part of that decision-making. Is that fair?
I would certainly hope so.
And so, given that would be your hope, it's alarming here, isn't it, that to the extent that it was a collective decision, no one seems to have understood that they were part of it.
Yes, it is very disappointing.
And would you agree with me that, perhaps to flag another potential explanation that's been offered by a witness, that to the extent that, for example, it turns out that it wasn't really a decision consciously made by anyone, but rather a kind of creeping assumption that formed amongst a group, that would be equally concerning, wouldn't it?
Perhaps even greater.
Because it would mean that no one had actually turned their mind at all, potentially, to whether or not the use of private security was a good idea, and whether or not the decision that had been made by someone with proper authority.
Ms. Elliard, that would, as I said, that would be even more concerning to me, because that's not a decision at all. That's just a series of assumptions.
And again, to pick up a point you've just made, whichever it is, creeping assumptions or a collective decision without a collective, we're left with a situation where no one owns the decision for the purposes of following up if it was the right one, and if it wasn't the right one, making necessary changes. Is that fair?
Yes, and these are some of the issues, although I stress not in as much detail as the board has looked at it, but these are some of the issues I confronted, which saw me on the 30th advise the governor to appoint the board. I couldn't get answers to these questions either.
And may I take it from that last answer, Premier, that you looked for them?
To a certain extent, I would not compare my efforts with the examination of hundreds of thousands of pages and many witnesses, but the answers, can I put it to you this way, Ms. Elliard, the answers were not obvious. They were not obvious.
Thank you. And another theme that's emerged where there seems to have been a lack of common understanding or a dispute is the board has heard evidence of differing views, both on the front line at hotels and all the way up to the ministerial level, differing views about who was ultimately in charge of and responsible for this program. Are you aware that that's the evidence that the board has received?
I am aware of that.
So purely by way of example, there's been evidence given by a number of people that it was the Department of Health and Human Services and therefore the Minister of Health who had accountability for the program, but the Minister for Health herself and the Secretary to that department have given evidence that they understood that it was a shared accountability model. Are you aware of that?
I am. I could refer you to my statement where I detail my understanding.
Indeed. You thought that it was DHHS and Minister Makakos from the 8th of April onwards until the change away to the Department of Justice. That's your view?
Yes, although I must add that's the primary agency, department and therefore minister. But there was, I think it's freely acknowledged and certainly was acknowledged in my mind, that there was some procurement of hotels and other similar procurement activity that was led by the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions, and therefore for those components, Minister Pakula would be accountable for those.
Yes, but the documentation that we've looked at, including the Operation Soteria plan that I took you to briefly, although we didn't go to that page, would suggest that, at least on paper, those procurement activities were in the service of an operation that was being run by DHHS. Is that fair?
That is correct. I'm sorry, I was only trying to be complete. Yeah. I agree with your first assertion, and my witness statement speaks directly to that about who had primary responsibility and carriage for these matters.
Did you see Ms. Peake, who was not just the Secretary to the Department of Health and Human Services, but also appointed by you to take on a mission lead role in the special COVID arrangements? Was she reporting to you on the hotel quarantine inquiry, it being part of her portfolio and part of a specific COVID-19 response?
I'm sorry, Ms. Elliott, you think you just asked me whether she was reporting to me about the inquiry? I'm
sorry, about the program.
Or the program?
Yeah.
Not the Secretary specifically. I think that we've provided, or so I can certainly confirm that the Minister would bring to CCC regular updates. So that would have been, that is where I would have been getting regular results, not, I think, with a direct communication between Secretary Peake and myself.
But wasn't that one of the functions of the MCC, that the possibility of a direct line of reporting and accountability between you and relevant secretaries?
Yes, it is, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every matter would come forward via that chain, or that link rather. Some would be secretary to the secretary of my department, and other matters would again be a bit superseded by the fact that they were coming to the Crisis Council of Cabinet, which is where regular updates came forward under the health portfolio and the Minister for Health's signature.
Does it concern you, Premier, that the Secretary of the Department and the Minister, who you've given evidence you saw as having accountability, seem to have not seen themselves as having accountability in the same way?
Yes.
There shouldn't be any degree of confusion about this, should there? Either at the Minister or Secretary level, or all the way down to the front desk at the hotel.
There should be none.
When one considers, firstly, that this was meant to be Victoria's contribution to a national response to prevent infections reaching Australia from overseas, there shouldn't be any confusion.
Yes, there should be none.
And there should be no confusion, given the very substantial demands being placed on those who were in the program. There should be no confusion at any level about who's responsible for their welfare and for ensuring their safety while they're effectively in the government's care.
No, it should be very clear.
Yeah. And again, thinking about the fact that this quarantine program was set up to be a first line of defence against the arrival of infections from overseas, there's no place at all for confusion, whether in a hotel or in upper management, about where accountability and responsibility lie.
No, there is no room for that.
Yeah. Bearing in mind, as we discussed earlier, that this whole program involved an assumption of risk and responsibility for managing risk by the government that would otherwise have remained with individuals who were quarantining at home.
Yes.
Would you agree with me, Premier, that the way in which this inquiry has been conducted and the fact of multiple separate government departments being separately represented and in some cases cross-examining each other's witnesses, that speaks to the presence of confusion at multiple levels?
Ms. Elliott, this is the first appearance I've made at an inquiry like this. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know that I could speak to whether that's a good, bad or indifferent thing. My understanding was that those arrangements are business as usual arrangements and are a feature. They have been for a long time. That was at least my understanding. I can't really provide. I don't have a base knowledge of what your profession and these sorts of inquiries look like normally, so I couldn't draw that conclusion.
So if I was to put to you, Premier, that it's not usually the case that separate departments are separately represented and cross-examine each other when there are inquiries of this kind. You wouldn't feel able to proffer an opinion on that for the reasons that you've outlined.
Ms. Elliott, that's certainly different to my understanding. But if you put that to me, and I will assume that that's accurate, and then I might be able to answer your question if you put it to me again.
Yeah, sure. Well, presume for the sake of the question, Mr. Andrews, that it's not usually the case that multiple government departments who've had a role in a matter under investigation are separately represented in the way that multiple departments have been separately represented in this proceeding. Assume from me that it's somewhat unusual. I'm inviting you to respond to my proposition that the fact that that's been seen by those departments to be necessary, it's not a criticism of them for taking that option, but the fact that it seems to have been seen by them to be necessary itself speaks, does it not, to there being different views and confusion within or amongst agencies about aspects of this program.
I think it could be read to mean that, yes, that wouldn't be an unreasonable conclusion to draw. Whether it were accurate or not, I can't speak to that. But
yeah. And the fact that in particular, representatives of some departments have, and I'm not suggesting that it was improper, but the fact that representatives of some departments have found it necessary to cross-examine representatives, witnesses representing other departments, and put to them matters that are plainly in controversy between two or more departments. Well, that's evidence itself, isn't it, that although there shouldn't have been confusion, there was in this program.
Perhaps, Ms. Elliott, if I can answer you this way, leaving the cross-examination and legal practice out of it, the fact that there's not agreement between agencies and departments is not desirable in any way.
Premier, you've been quoted recently, I think, as, and I'm going to be paraphrasing you, so please correct me if I've paraphrased you poorly, but you've been quoted as saying recently that mistakes were made in the program and that those mistakes are unacceptable to you. Those weren't your exact words, but do you recall making remarks to that effect, perhaps in the last week or so?
Yes.
What mistakes were you referring to?
I'm referring to the fact that this was a program designed to stop this wildly infectious virus seeding from return travellers into the Victorian community. That has clearly happened, and that is clearly a failure, and that is clearly the product of at least one error and perhaps multiple errors. I'm not in a position to be able to detail individual errors or mistakes or deficiencies. That is rightly the province of this board. But I'm referring, I think, in more aggregate terms, it was supposed to contain the virus. It didn't. Therefore, something has gone wrong. And I'm basically waiting for this inquiry to provide me with some insights into that.
So you don't yourself have a view on what went wrong?
No, I think I don't have a view. What's more, I don't know that it's appropriate, if I can say, Ms. Elliott, for me to establish an inquiry and then seek to run an inquiry myself. I'm very respectful of this process, and you've looked through 200,000 pages of 200,000 pages of different documents. You've heard from many, many witnesses. I'm not in a position to do that sort of work, so that's why we set this process up.
Are you aware of a view within your government about what the mistakes were, what the more precise mistakes were?
Not specifically. There may be many different views in the broader Victorian community. I wouldn't doubt that, given the seriousness and the significance of these issues. But I want the answers that we all need, and I think the board has a critical role to play in that.
Can I ask you to look at this document, please, Premier? And I'm going to call for it's a document prepared for a meeting of the Crisis Council of Cabinet that was the 27th of June. The date's not on the document I'm going to show you, but we know that it's that date from the red that accompanies it. The document is dpc.001.001.0463, please, Mr. Operator. And once we get there, could we go through to page 0464? Again, Premier, I know you receive a lot of these, but we can infer that you would have received this document, it being a submission to the Crisis Council of Cabinet.
Yes, and the red that accompanied it that you just referred to.
Yes, and perhaps as a matter of fairness, could we go to the first page, please, Mr. Operator, so that I can show the Premier the heading.
Thank you.
The submission title is Alternative Supervision Model for the COVID-19 Hotel Quarantine. And thinking about timing, this is the 27th of June. We talked a little earlier about arrangements that you understood were in train at the time of the ADF request on the 24th and 25th of June. I take it that these were the arrangements that you had in mind when you talked about the potential for a reset?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. If we could now go to the second page, please. There's a heading, Key Issues.
Yes.
And under the head, there's a number of issues that are identified, but then further down the page at paragraph 6, there's a heading in bold. DHS is putting in place, in response to those issues that have been raised, DHS is putting in place comprehensive infection prevention and control strategies across all workforces.
Yes.
And there's a number of matters there set out that are going to be the subject of action that will represent a difference to, one infers, the way the program had been run to that point.
Yes.
And it appears that they related to matters of education and training. We see that at the bottom of the page.
Yes.
And then over to the next page, there's reference to briefings about infection prevention under B.
Yes.
And behavioural changes and rostering matters, and then other matters relating to screening and surveillance testing at sites. Yes. And the provision of expert services, and there's a reference there to Alfred Health, and the board has heard evidence that Alfred Health were brought on at a point in time to provide clinical expertise to the program.
Yes.
So these were all matters that, as I understand it, were brought to the Crisis Council of Cabinet as part of what became an iterative process of resetting or transitioning the hotel quarantine program to a different model.
That is correct.
And one can assume that all of those matters that were proposed in the submission found favour with the Crisis Council and were put into effect.
Yes.
Thank you. That can come from the screen. Could we now go to a different document? I'm drawing you now, Premier, to a document of a similar kind, and the date is the 9th of July. Again, we know that from the red, but I'll take you to the substantive submission. DPC.0012.0001.0532. And again, looking at the first page, there's a heading, Mandatory Quarantine Accommodation Program.
Yes.
You see that? And we see, if we zero in, please, Mr. Operator, on the recommendations, that the Crisis Council was being asked to approve the transfer of accountability from the Minister for Health to the Attorney General.
Yes.
And if we go over to the third page, please, Mr. Operator, there's a number of matters referred to under a heading of key issues.
Yes.
And you will have seen this at the time, Premier, and if we look at that document, and please take the time that you want to read it, there's a number of matters set out there that are going to be part of the approach that's followed along with the transfer of accountability to the Attorney General.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you very much. That can come. And again, we take it that those changes were implemented. They were considered by the Crisis Council to be appropriate matters to put in place.
Yes.
Thank you. That can come from the screen, Mr. Operator. And then the last document that I'll want you to look at, please, Premier, is a similar document. This one's from the 27th of July. Again, we know the date from the red, but may I take you to the submission, which is DPC.0012.0001.0834. Whenever there's a delay, I think I might have made a mistake in the numbering, for which I apologise. DPC.001.2.0001.0834, please, Mr. Operator. The Cabinet in Confidence document of the 27th of July. So the heading of this submission is Transfer and Integration of COVID-19 Hotel Quarantine and Emergency Accommodation Program, Premier.
Yes.
And the recommendations reflect the effect of the document that we looked at previously, that the Attorney General had assumed responsibility for the detention of people who were arriving from overseas in quarantine.
Correct, yes.
And that the Department of Justice and Community Safety had assumed progressively responsibility for that program, and was, by reason of the matters in this submission, going to have that implemented longer term as what I'm going to call the new model. Is that fair?
Yes, yes, that's fair and correct.
Thank you very much. And reasons are given for why it is that's appropriate, and details given in this document of the arrangements that are going to be in place going forward. That can come from the screen. So, Premier, I want to put to you that the net effect of those three stages that we've looked at, the 27th of June, the 9th of July, and then the 27th of July, is pretty clear evidence that, in fact, the government did identify relevant aspects of the program that had created the opportunity for problems, and in particular for the outbreaks that occurred. Do you accept that?
I think, yes, I don't think that's unreasonable. I think that there's some risks are well known and well understood, and you do your level best to try and manage those, but it's not a conclusive list of issues, and that's why I've made it clear, Ms. Elliard, that when it comes to return travellers, I want to see the board's report before I settle on, or our government settles on, a final model.
Firstly, I want to submit to you that what clearly emerges from those documents and the decisions that the government has taken since late June is the recognition that there needs to be a much greater focus on clinical matters and greater involvement of medical clinical expertise. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Secondly, the documentation indicates the need for an appropriate workforce, a workforce with the skill sets and supports that make them the right ones for the jobs that need to be done in hotel quarantine. Do you accept that?
Yes.
And thirdly, those documents reflect a recognition within government that there's a need for a clear line of control and the actual active exercise of that control by whoever has been nominated as the one in charge.
Yes.
So isn't that the answer? Isn't that what went wrong? The absence of those three things?
Well, the absence of those things and potentially other factors.
Such an inquiry has been necessary.
It's not a foolish question at all, Ms. Elliard. It is the need to have an inquiry, the reality that what has gone on here, there is no complete picture without an inquiry, is not only disappointing, it is unacceptable.
Thank you, Premier. Madam Chair, those are the questions that I have for the Premier. I note the time, but I also am aware of only one application for leave to cross-examine, which I'm told, if it is granted, wouldn't take very long. So I'm in the board's hands about whether we take a break, and in the Premier's hands as well if a break is needed. We've been going a while, but if we're going on, I'll call on Mr. Moses to make his application and perhaps identify those parts of it which are persisted with, given the evidence that's already been given.
So first, give me an indication of what your application is, Mr. Moses, and how long it's likely to take.
It's only now in relation to two issues because the matter's covered by my learned friend. The first relates to information which was provided to the Premier as to what caused the outbreaks at the Ridges on the 26th of May and the Stanford on the 17th of June 2020 in the period leading up to the 1st of July 2020 when he made some public statements about that issue. That's the first issue, because that's important to find out who was telling him information about security firms. The second issue is what steps, if any, did the Premier take himself to ascertain the truth or accuracy of the information that was being provided to him that led him to make public statements concerning security firms and guards on the 1st of July 2020. Those are the two issues. Fred has covered all the other issues.
All right. So would I be right in assessing, Mr. Moses, that we're talking a matter of minutes?
We're talking about 15 minutes, 20 minutes maximum, Madam Chair. Could be less.
Mr. O'Mara, do you want to be heard on that application?
Yes, if I might be, Madam Chair. The first point sounds more like it's directed to the Premier's appearance as a witness and how you might assess his evidence, rather than something that's likely to assist you, Madam Chair, in determining matters. We understand the practice note does not permit this kind of cross-examination that might be in the trade called cross-examination as to credit. And that sounds like that's the subject of the first matter. The second matter, inquiring into the inquiries that the Premier made before establishing the board, sounds like it's unlikely to assist you, Madam Chair, in making findings in the matter. It's not possible really to see what the relevance of those matters are or might be.
Madam Chair, if I could just respond briefly. My learned friend may not be aware of this, but on the 30th of June, the Premier announced the establishment of an inquiry. But on the 1st of July, in an interview with Lee Sales on the ABC 7:30 program, he stated, we have some very clear suspicions about what's gone on here. I'm entitled to ask him, because he made a number of statements concerning that issue as to where he got that information from, and what steps he took to test the accuracy of that information, and whether in fact what he should have been doing is testing the people who gave him the information as to what the hell had gone on in respect of infection control measures at these hotels. So a friend may not be aware of it, but there is a statement that the Premier made on the 1st of July in which a representation was made. We're entitled to ask him about that issue.
So you haven't grappled with the objection that's being made, though, Mr. Moses, by Mr. O'Mara, which
it's not a matter of credit. It's not a matter of credit. It's not a matter of credit, Madam Chair. He's misunderstood the issue. The issue goes directly to a statement made by the Premier on the 1st of July in which he made a representation. We have some very clear suspicions about what's gone on here. There are a number of staff who, despite knowing about infection control protocols, have decided to make a number of errors. Now, we're entitled to find out where he got that information from, because part of your remit is to ascertain whether there's been any duck shoving that's gone on here by the government by blaming others for their failures. Now, who gave him that information and what steps were taken to test it? That is a very serious issue when you've had public reports made based on statements that private security guards were in effect to blame for what's gone on here. Now, we're entitled to know, where did he get that information from? If he can't recall, that's fine. But it's on the public record. It's not a secret. He said it, and he said it after he announced the establishment of this inquiry. So it's a very simple question. If he doesn't know, he doesn't know. But this is a very serious issue when a lot of the answers that have been given to this inquiry is people don't know. Well, that's fine. But somebody knew something because the Premier of the state said something. And that is a very important issue when it comes to ensuring that accurate information is provided.
I'm assuming I'm assuming rather than just to short circuit this process, Mr. Moses, that what you're indicating is that rather than it going to the to an issue of credit with respect to this witness, that it goes to an issue of reputational damage with respect to your client.
Correct. And also, and importantly also, where this information came from, because it's quite a serious issue for such a representation to be made by the Premier of a state that they've got suspicions about what's gone on here, because you've had no evidence led before you in this inquiry by anybody representing the Crown in any of their emanations on what is said to be that suspicion. Like, yeah. People have been asked.
All right. I'm going to allow you to ask that question, Mr. Moses, and we'll come to the second part of it, depending on what the answer is to the first part.
Thank you. Madam Chair, first of all, Council Assisting correctly asked whether Mr. Andrews wanted to have a break before the commencement. I don't know whether that's been asked of Mr. Andrews.
Mr. Andrews, I'm not sure whether, Premier, I'm sorry, I'm not sure whether or not you appreciate what's happening. Mr. Moses is the only party of the considerable range of parties that are at this virtual bar table who's seeking the opportunity to ask some further questions of you. He's indicating to me that he thinks he'll be about 15 or 20 minutes. It's 25 to 5 now. We normally try and finish the afternoon sittings by at least about 4:15. So we're running over time. We could take a 15-minute break now and give you a break, or we could continue. So my inquiry of you is whether or not you're content to continue now or prefer a short break.
Madam Chair, I'm content to continue and given the lateness of the hour.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If the witness could be shown, come on the screen, the document, which is USG 0001 0016 0001, which is the interview with Lee Sales on the ABC 7:30 program on the 1st of July 2020. And it's on page 1 of the document, and you'll see, Mr. Andrews, it's the second time you appear on that page. So you'll see, first of all, you've said in response to a question from the presenter, well, I think the first point to make is that there's been some infection control breaches in Victoria that have not occurred in New South Wales. Do you see that?
Yes, I do, Mr. Moses.
Yes, thank you. And if the operator could then take us to page 2, which is the second time that you appear on that page. And what you see there in what's attributed to you, it's recorded that you said this in the 3rd paragraph. We have some very clear suspicions about what's gone on here. There are a number of staff who, despite knowing about infection control protocols, have decided to make a number of errors. I'll give you one example. We think one of these outbreaks may be attributable to people sharing a cigarette lighter, something as innocent as that. This thing is so widely infectious that it only takes one, and if that person who's infected then goes and is part of a large family, that large family meets with other large families, all of a sudden you've got an outbreak and you get to the position we're in now. You see that?
Yes, I do.
Mr. Andrews, in relation to your statement to Ms. Sales that we have some very clear suspicions about what's gone on here. There are a number of staff who, despite knowing about infection control protocols, have decided to make a number of errors. Can you recall sitting here today who provided you with that information?
I can't provide you with a specific briefing or document. I could speak to my usual practice when drawing such conclusions in relation to the virus, Mr. Moses, if that would help.
No. What I'd like to learn, and your counsel may want to ask you those questions, but what I'd like to know is, sitting here today, do you have a recollection as where that information may have come from?
My only recollection is that will not, I think, have come from one single source, Mr. Moses. It will have come from multiple sources as a result of contact tracing, chains of transmission, and other information that is provided to me on a routine basis, much of which we don't identify to an individual for obvious privacy reasons. I can't provide you with a name. No, I can't.
Okay. And could I ask you this question in relation to the statement that is attributed to you, which makes reference to infection control protocols. Do you know, sitting here today, what infection control protocols were in place at the Ridges Hotel where COVID-19 positive guests were being held?
I'm sorry, Mr. Moses. What is your exact question?
Well, the question relates to the statement you said on the 1st of July. There are a number of staff who, despite knowing about infection control protocols, have decided to make a number of errors. Sitting here today, Mr. Andrews, can you recall what infection control protocols you were referring to when you made that statement to Ms. Sales?
I'm not an infection control expert, Mr. Moses, but when a virus gets out of a contained environment, I don't think it an unreasonable conclusion to think that there has been an infection control breach.
Well, Mr. Andrews, you've told us that you're not an infection control expert,
No, I'm
correct?
not. But I am able to make reasonable assumptions, I would have thought. But the answer is no, Mr. Moses. I cannot detail for you in precise terms the infection control protocols that were or weren't in a particular hotel on a particular day.
And do you accept the proposition that when making statements to the public about what has potentially occurred in relation to the outbreaks in May, June this year, you would be careful not to cast aspersions as to who was to blame without having a proper basis for it, correct?
I would accept that, yes.
And the reason why that is important is so that false information is not spread within the community as to how the outbreak occurred, correct?
It's my expectation that I am accurate and fair in all of my public comments, Mr. Moses.
Yes, and it's important also to ensure that persons are not blamed for causing the outbreak in breach of infection control procedures unless that conduct has actually occurred, correct?
I think that's fair, yes.
And as Council Sisting has taken you to, you in November 2018, of course, October 2018, set up the review into private security in Victoria, correct?
Yes.
And the reason you did that was in order to ensure that workers were paid properly and fairly, because you were concerned that they are amongst the most lowly paid workers, correct?
Correct.
Yes. And you wanted to ensure, of course, that those workers who are amongst the most marginalised because they undertake casual work were treated fairly, correct?
Yes.
Yes. And can we assume that in respect of your views as set out in this transcript that I've taken you to, these were views that you formed based on information that you were told rather than anything you know firsthand, correct?
That's correct, yes. Yes, that's correct, Mr. Moses.
Yes, thank you. And when did you find out about the outbreaks at the Ridges Hotel in May?
I would have been informed on or about the time the outbreak became clear via testing, tracing, and the normal work that I am briefed on routinely and that I report to the public daily.
Thank you. And can you tell us this? After you made the statement to Ms. Sales on the 1st of July 2020, did you have any conversations with Ms. Peake, who Council Sisting has told us was reporting to you, as to how this outbreak occurred?
Not that I specifically recall. No detailed conversation directly with her, no.
Thank you. And do you know whether anybody briefed you after the 1st of July about what, in fact, infection control protocols had been put in place by the Department of Health and Human Services at the Ridges?
Specifically at the Ridges, Mr. Moses?
Correct.
No, I couldn't attest to that. I couldn't recall that level of detail, no.
Okay. I've no further questions of Mr. Andrews. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Mr. Moses.
Thank you,
Mr.
Madam
O'Mara,
Chair.
I'm sorry, Ms. Aliad. I was just going to ask Mr. O'Mara if there were any matters that he wished to put to his client.
Pardon me, Your Honour. Thank you. We're grateful for the opportunity, Madam Chair. There's only one question that I have for the Premier, and that concerns the fact that he's been asked a great many questions this afternoon concerning the operation of the hotel quarantine program, and arising from those questions and the evidence that he's given, it might be that he may have some perhaps reflections concerning the operation of the program, and if that would assist you, Madam Chair, I'd seek to ask him whether he would give you the benefit personally of his personal reflection.
Yes, I'll allow you to do that, Mr. O'Mara.
Madam Chair, if I can briefly make a couple of very important points. Mistakes have been made in this program and answers are required. Those mistakes are unacceptable to me. I want to thank you, Madam Chair, and the Board of Inquiry and all of your staff for the work that you are doing and will do. I want to make it very clear to each and every member of the Victorian community that I am sorry for what has occurred here. And I want to issue an unreserved apology to all Victorians. And I want to say to you, Madam Chair, that I await your final report, the conclusion of your work, so that we can understand better what has occurred, and so that I, as the Leader of the Government, can take the appropriate action to ensure that these sorts of errors never occur again.
Nothing further, Mr. O'Mara?
No, Your Honour. No, Madam Chair.
Nothing further, Ms. Aliad?
No, thank you, Madam Chair. I would ask that the Premier be excused with the inquiries. Thanks. That's the end of his evidence.
Thank you, Premier. There are still some matters that we have to deal with to close this aspect of the inquiry, but I don't need to continue to have you on the screen to do that. There are some matters that I know are coming from Ms. Aliad. So I will thank you for your attendance at the board and otherwise excuse you, which means you're now able to turn off your camera and your microphone.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, as you have foreshadowed, I'm aware that perhaps this being the last day of evidentiary hearings, there are a number of applications by parties seeking to add to the evidentiary record by tendering documents. And I might call on them in the order that I think will take the least time, with the shortest application first. So may I call on those representing Minister Makakos? I understand they have an application to tender a document.
Thank you, Councillor Sisting. Madam Chair, since Minister Makakos gave her evidence yesterday, there have been a number of reports in the media suggesting that the evidence she gave to this board about when she first became aware of the use of private security in the hotel quarantine program may have misled the board. That is a suggestion that she categorically denies. Now, regrettably, the matters in those media reports were not put to the Minister yesterday when she gave her evidence, so she wasn't able to respond to them. And when I say that, I don't mean a criticism of anybody, because she was cross-examined by learned and experienced counsel who no doubt would have put relevant matters to her. But in the circumstances, she seeks leave, if the board thinks it appropriate, to tender a short supplementary statement that deals with those matters. We've circulated it to all those with leave to appear, and we don't know whether there's any objection to that, but it's been provided to Councillor Sisting as well.
Do you want to be heard on this application, Ms. Aliad?
I don't, Madam Chair, subject, of course, to any natural justice issues that any other party may wish to raise, given that the evidence is going to be arriving after the opportunity to question the Minister has passed. But absent anyone else's having an objection, I don't object to the tender.
All right. I haven't seen the statement, Ms. Schoff, so I don't know what its contents is. I'll be guided by counsel assisting. If no objections being raised to it, I will accept it into the evidence
As the board pleases.
And mark it in as Exhibit 222.
As the board pleases.
Madam Chair, I'm also aware of an application that has been foreshadowed by Counsel for the Department of Health and Human Services for the tender of a number of documents. I think there's a couple of tranches of them, and I might defer to Ms. Harris to make that application and identify the materials she wishes to tender and why.
Thank you, Ms. Elliard. The documents, Madam Chair, that we wish to tender now relate primarily to documents that were referred to in witness statements, but were not tendered. Madam Chair, you might recall that there was a time in the proceeding when application was made to tender the exhibits or the documents referred to in DHHS statements, and subsequent to that time, a number of documents were then uploaded to the online hearing book. And with the assistance of my instructing solicitors, we've looked at the documents that have been uploaded and understand that not all documents referred to in statements have been have been tendered, and we did identify some documents that are relevant to the matters that have been discussed before the board, and of course, having been referred to in statements, were responsive to the questions that were asked of the witnesses when they gave their statements.
Sorry, Ms. Harris, just so that I can understand, is what you're saying is there are documents that were on the hearing book have been properly produced by your client responsive to notices, and you now wish to tender them, or is that not correct?
Almost, Your Honour, Madam Chair, they weren't produced by our client.
They were produced.
They were not. They were referred to in the witness statements of some other witnesses. The witnesses are Ms. Curtin of your nursing agency, Dr. Garrow of On-Site Doctor, Mr. Eric Smith of the Australian Nursing Agency, and then the bundle of documents referred to in a statement of an operations coordinator and site manager who's not been named. That last statement was tendered by Ms. Robertson, and that was my oversight, Madam Chair. I hadn't understood that the documents were not also tendered with that statement. But the other witnesses that I have read out, and including, Madam Chair, that Mr. De Cruz of Crown Hotels, some of the documents in Ms. Curtin, Dr. Garrow and Mr. Smith's statements have been tendered, but not all, and we would seek leave to tender some other documents that we say are relevant to the matters before the board. And with Mr. De Cruz,
again, just to understand this, are these documents that were on the hearing book?
They were, yes, Madam Chair.
All right, as opposed to the first lot of documents that weren't.
When Madam Chair refers to the first lot of documents.
Well, the first bundle that you've identified, I thought you indicated that there were some documents that actually weren't on the hearing book, so that they weren't produced in response to any notice.
Madam Chair, there's a separate category of documents that I have not yet described that are documents that are responsive to one of the notices to produce, but have the importance and relevance of those documents have become apparent in the course of the hearing, and they have actually been referred to in some statements of my witnesses, the Department of Health and Human Services witnesses, and I can come to that, but that is a separate category.
All right.
So the first category, if it's of any assistance to read out the documents, there are two documents exhibited to the statement of Ms. Curtin.
Yes.
JMC5, which was a spreadsheet that identified the nurses that were deployed by that agency in the program. It's YNA.0001.0001.0079. The second is exhibit JMC11 to Ms. Curtin's statement, examples of posters used on the hotel sites, which is YNA.0001.0001.0120. For Dr. Garrow's statement, there is Annexure 2, which is information about the on-site Doctor Proprietary Limited Victorian Quarantine Hotels Medical Services. And that document is WIT.PLLC